All right, thanks, Colin, and good afternoon, everyone. Hi, I'm Brian Healy, Director of Global Ethanol Market Development with the U.S. Grains Council. Pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. I want to talk about some of not only the headwinds that the incoming administration is facing, especially related to the macroeconomic environment related to COVID, but also talk about some of the carryover trade policy opportunities and how the council is best positioned to deliver on these for 2021. So we started off the year, this was our fourth largest export year at 1.36 billion gallons. That's marketing year from September through August. Really our biggest trade policy issue that's carried over into this administration is the now 20% tariff on U.S. ethanol going into Brazil. We had seen a period of relative free trade between the U.S. and Brazil from 2012 to 2017, at which point in August of 2017, in the beginning of September, a 20% or TRQ was placed upon U.S. product going into that market. That was in place for 2 years and then expanded slightly in volume for 2019 to 2020. We saw a brief 90-day extension at the end of 2020, and then December 15th, we now, as of December 15th, now have a 20% tariff on all U.S. product going into that market. So I want to show you kind of what that looks like in terms of our export volumes. As you can see from this chart, this is the last 3 marketing years, or the years that there was a TRQ on U.S. ethanol going into that market. You can see a pretty precipitous decline. Looking at the chart on the right, the first golden area is the U.S. U.S. exports in market year 2017-18, and then subsequent years. You have pretty steep drop off year over year to the point now where the first 4 months of this marketing year, we're down about 75% in terms of overall exports. So, I will note that this 20% tariff and the TRQ did have an impact on that, but there certainly are some other factors that also reduced Brazilian demand over that time period. One of it, especially in 2020, was the impact of demand that we saw associated with COVID lockdown and restrictions. So that certainly weighed on their overall imports and ethanol use in country. They had a similar drop off in terms of overall demand that we saw here in the United States, as well as every other country relative to stay-at-home orders. We also see some currency fluctuations in terms of the Brazilian real depreciation against the U.S. dollar, and then the further impact of the COVID restrictions weighed on the price spread between product coming out of the United States and coming out of Santos at that time. So in terms of the TRQ, right now we saw that on day one that the Biden administration came in. President Bolsonaro sent a letter to the White House advocating for cooperation on the Paris Agreement commitment, climate change, energy, and specifically on biofuels. To date, as far as we're aware, the U.S. administration has not responded yet to that letter. And so really it rests in the hands on the expectations as the administration kind of staffs up and gets the political folks in place. We certainly saw the confirmation for Secretary Vilsack and Ambassador Tai's confirmation hearing is underway soon. And so really waiting until those politicals get put in place to see how the administration lands on follow-up with Brazil. Coming into this administration and especially some concern amongst the industry was seeing the kind of unexpected or kind of light touch that may be expected given the what was a kind of not a trade deal, but it was an agreement on syncing standards and regulations between the U.S. and Brazil. That was back in April of 2020. And there was some hesitancy in the House on approving that, especially because of concerns over deforestation in the rainforest and some human rights issues. And our concern was that those may also further limit dialogue between the U.S. and Brazil in resolving this issue. I will say that we do have a team that's in country now. They are, have worked with us since August of last year. And so they are working directly with the Brazilian government as well as Brazilian industry to make sure, it's clear and communicated that it's our industry priority to remove this tariff. So again, we continue to convey this with the career level staff that are at USCA, USCR, as well as in the embassy, and still at this point really waiting to get those confirmations on and get political direction from the cabinet members. So looking at some other trade policy carryover issues, the EU, we had a surveillance mechanism that was initiated in November of 2020. We initiated counsel to support us here, especially in conveying comments to the Commission that, one, the U.S. is not dumping into that market. It's a reflection of high prices that were exacerbated because of the COVID situation. To date, we have not seen any formal declaration that a anti-dumping duty case will be initiated against U.S. products. But typically, when a surveillance mechanism is initiated, that's sort of the next step. So again, for 4 months into this process now, we have not seen that indication. Our counsel on the ground has been in touch with the Commission. And so we need to continue to monitor that over the next 9 months. And, really what we saw early on is especially a lot of the French ethanol feedstock producer associations, as well as the ethanol associations, trying to look for ways of relief based upon, overall loss of demand, again, related to COVID. We had seen Colombia implement a similar type of measure last year for 4 months, where they effectively banned ethanol imports over a period of time, and so really wanted to avoid any type of recreation of that system in the EU or any other market. So at this point, again, we don't have any indication that a trade policy case is moving forward, but it's something we are involved with at this time. The next two items is, trade agreement discussions that have been initiated by the Trump administration. India was one where we had ethanol and DDGs, raised pretty highly on that agenda. There was a lot of discussion and a lot of work that the administration did on trying to come in agreement with the Indian side on that. Unfortunately, there was no agreement and no volumetric commitments from the Indian side for purchases, and so or a dollar figure, and so that sort of is hanging out there as something that we see as unresolved. From our end, it's one of the the greatest level of progress that we had seen in terms of trade talks between the U.S. and India, especially relative to our products. So our goal is to have the administration continue that dialogue and hopefully get something meaningful out of that trade agreement. As you know, with India, we're currently exporting to that market for the industrial use. We don't have access to a growing fuel market there because of the way their policy is written. So that would be the ultimate goal out of a trade agreement with them. And then we still have free trade agreements discussions ongoing with the UK as well as Kenya, needing to see those resolved. And again, waiting for really political leadership to be put in place to see, provide direction in terms of where that's headed. Looking at China, we've certainly seen some good news relative to corn and also ethanol purchases over the last month and a half, and so that's that's good. certainly within phase one, we had advocated for much greater volumes of ethanol, closer in the billion-gallon range. We're out about expectation is about 225 million gallons at this point. But we also have some other outstanding issues. We've got a 30 and 40% rate for ethanol going into that market without any of the 232 or 301 duties on it. So wanting to make that overall reduction happen, as well as a continuation of this national policy implementation that we had seen back in 2017 as that was first announced. China has a number of provinces that have E10 policies, but really the ultimate goal is to have that national policy implemented. Not only does it create full production for the Chinese, but it certainly creates a large trade opportunity for here in the U.S. In terms of some of the macroeconomic headwinds that I mentioned, fuel demand recovery is one of them. Really, it's not expected until 2022, which is going to weigh on trade. You can see from the chart here, this is a global ethanol projection expected down about 6 billion gallons in 2020. The lion's share, of course, coming from the U.S., but also you see reductions across the board from Brazil, the EU, Canada, as well as other parts of Asia and Latin America, and really don't see recovery as of today until 2022. And that, of course, relies upon expectations of continued vaccine uptake and kind of the status quo with how stay-at-home orders have been issued around the world. The other issue kind of hanging out there is low market share or overall low blend rates in certain markets. This is Japan. We had recently great success in the Japanese market in that we were finally able to export U.S. ethanol to that market. Prior to 2018, we had no access to that market, but after working with the Japanese authorities, they made some revisions to their policy, and U.S. ethanol, as it was demonstrated to meet their emissions reductions requirements, was allowed into that market. But looking at the chart on the right, and this is to 2017, you can extend that out 5 more years to 2022. There's a flat overall demand in gasoline or ETBE use in the Japanese market. So it's essentially capped at 217 million gallons. And so that is effectively a 1.8% blend rate. So you've got, a top 10 gasoline market, but with just 1.8% penetration rate of biofuels or renewable content into their fuel supply. So certainly that's going to weigh on their overall demand, especially if it's capped. And frankly, fuel use in the market is declining. So part of what we're trying to do in Japan, and the same is true in China and India, other major fuel markets that have low overall penetration rates of biofuels into their supply, is raise that rate, get it out of a provincial level, which is the case in China, get it out of just ETBE use, which is the case in Japan, and remove the ban from importing fuel ethanol so that the Indians can finally achieve this 10% blend rate that's been so elusive that they've just pushed down the road for the last decade or more. So blend rate is the other factor that we're trying to overcome here.
Brian?
Yes.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
On that, when you talk about that low rate, are you just talking U.S. ethanol? Because they still don't pay a fair amount from Brazil?
Yeah, so this would be total ethanol that would go into the Japanese market is capped at 217 million gallons. So the market share has changed in that the U.S. now has 66% of that, but the problem is that the volume is constant, and so until the Japanese change that policy and either double the rate of ETBE use in the market or move to direct blending, we're capped at pretty much 1.8% penetration rate into Japan.
Thank you.
Sure.
Brian, and
Yes.
if I remember right from, I think this was the Asia team, they're running essentially this. I mean, they are the same vehicles, the same engines we are, but they've got all theirs tagged that you're not supposed to put even E10 in them. Is that correct, or is it E15? Are they? Which do you remember which it is?
Yeah, well, I mean, so the Japanese automakers have said that E3 is the maximum rate that they can use, despite having largely the same vehicles that they're using in the U.S. And every other major market around the world. So it's definitely a disparity that we're trying to inform them of and overcome, because it's that will weigh on our market access there.
Thank you.
And then the last point in terms of carryover challenges for ethanol is lots of policies and making sure they all fit together. There's been a number of net zero carbon neutral policy announcements. That seems to be 2025 to 2060, depending on the market. You've got Paris Agreement commitments. You've got federal policies and provincial level policies that aren't all quite talking to each other. For this, I used Canada as an example. So this is just one example of multiple different policies at the federal level, at a at a provincial level, and then also at sort of a aspirational level. So you've got Canada has in place a 5% flat mandate on overall requirements for ethanol. You have different penetration rates in the Canadian market depending upon the provinces, and then you have a number of announcements where the National Clean Fuel Standard is looking to include an average of 15% ethanol across the board by 2030, but you've got kind of different implementation rates depending on the province. So Quebec, for example, not really blending now, but looking at a 15% rate. Well, initially was looking at a 10% rate by this year, and then a 15% rate by 2025. Ontario, similar. You have a blend rate goal of 10% that has a GHG reduction requirement, and then looking to move to a 15% reduction. And then you can see kind of the differences in policies across the different provinces. This is one market where you have so much differentiation in those policies, even in a single country. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that the policies are aligned with the product that we have available, but also that they aren't sort of double taxing or doubled up on each other, so that you don't have a blend mandate on top of a net zero goal, on top of a carbon tax, that all then combined create some either an untenable policy environment that consumers and the constituents can't maintain, and so then you start to see an erosion of some of those values, or where it's perceived that this is just adding cost of doing business in certain markets. So I would say this is a rather complex example. Really, the floor here in Canada is the 5% overall blend rate. But if you look at, especially policies like Renovo Bio in Brazil, and the certification process required there versus, getting into the EU market, it's a lot of different policies that aren't necessarily talking to each other. And so our goal is to try to, as best as possible, demonstrate comparability and reciprocity between the policies, so that producers in the U.S. don't have to make specs for each individual market. There can be a more cohesive ecosystem there. So when I transition to creating opportunities, as I mentioned, climate is one of those big opportunities. I think most of us saw that recent report that came out demonstrating a 46% GHG reduction for U.S. ethanol. That certainly the timing of that report is good, given the priorities outlined in the Biden administration. we saw that the U.S. has now signed on to the Paris Agreement again, and is working to nationally determine commitments to overall reductions there, as well as raising the role of ethanol in the climate dialogue in multilateral institutions. You have the International Energy Agency, which sort of houses a lot of the forward-thinking research for energy use and also different vehicle systems that remain key. They are a big believer in using policies in order to elevate and increase the role of biofuels in certain markets, but they also have positions on other things like electrification. And we've also seen it's not only EV groups as well as biofuel groups talking about their ability to meet Paris Agreement reductions. OPEC has a stance on how they are working to meet Paris Agreement reductions. So everyone has, frankly, a marketing angle in this space, and so we need to make sure that we have a good story, we have a good narrative, and we've got to make sure that we're sharing it, so that we frankly don't get left behind as the focus on EV continues to pick up. And then the other component here, making sure that we're elevating ethanol to a whole U.S. government approach, especially for the foreign market development side. We've seen again indicators that climate will be included in every agency within the government, and so making sure that we have great connections with USDA, USTR, making sure we continue to build out those connections with the State Department as well as Department of Commerce and others, so that we are kind of taking the offensive with them rather than seeking out their help when we have a trade policy issue or a trade barrier that we're running into. So really elevating that climate narrative about ethanol, it's a good story, and it's something that we need to make sure we continue to get in front of the administration. Other factors, continuing to reduce and eliminate any barriers to trade. Key here is first identifying what they are. That's our global staff has done a good job in getting consultants in the right areas so that we can identify what all of these barriers are. Indonesia is an example where on their fuel tender there was actually language banning ethanol to be blended into fuel before it was imported into that market, and so that was one step of many of these types of barriers that exist around the world that need to be eliminated to make sure that we have access to our product. We certainly saw a disruption to our price competitiveness narrative over the last year. Even if we have the most competitive product on the market, if we've got barriers like an outright ban or high tariffs on our product relative to other energy components, it's going to be very difficult to get access to that market. And so that's why tariff parity is another priority here. I'll show you an example. This is another example from Indonesia. You see that highlighted column. Basically, it shows the tariff rates for different energy products going into the market. You have gasoline, you have the different VTX components as well as MTBE, and then you have ethanol. Ethanol there is at a 30% rate compared to 0 and 5% for these other components. In part, some of these policies were set at a time when ethanol wasn't traded globally at a large volume, and so the use in the fuel market wasn't considered. It was more of positioning so that the product would not, harm the small industrial markets that exist in many markets, which is the case in Indonesia. They have 2 ethanol producers that produce for the industrial market. And so it's making sure that we're working with, not only our government, but also the Indonesian authorities to identify this issue and let them know, at 30%, you're never going to be able to, achieve the full economic benefits, let alone the other environmental and human health benefits of using ethanol. If you look across from left to right on that 30% tariff line for ethanol, you can also see what that rate is for other countries that Indonesia has free trade agreements with. And so, see ASEAN, which is a collection of countries in the region. You've got individual markets like Korea, India. All of those tariffs are also much lower than this 30% rate that the U.S. has, highlighting, one, the importance of having free trade agreements with markets that we see as has large potential, but also, where we are competing against other markets in terms of access. Not a lot of ethanol is coming from these other markets, but it's certainly a reflection that we've always got to be competitive on a tariff line standpoint against other free trade agreements, and make sure that as these free trade agreements are negotiated, we're putting in our information or putting in our dialogue to ensure that tariff lines for our products continue to be reduced. From the industrial side, I'm using Japan as an example again. From an industrial side, we've seen some opportunities. You've seen ethanol replace methanol and things like windshield washer fluid in markets like the EU as well as Korea. So that kind of replacing one product and using ethanol in lieu of that is an example of how we've seen industrial ethanol be used. We've certainly seen new uses of ethanol in the bioplastics markets, but we've also seen the need to disrupt some of the traditional relationships that have been established for industrial suppliers into the industrial ethanol market. And so I use the Japanese market as an example, where aside from ETBE, there's a pretty large industrial market there, about 150 million gallons a year, and U.S. market share is relatively low, 15 to 25%, depending on the year. And so you've got primarily Brazilian product, but also Pakistani product that takes up a pretty large portion there. And so it's really about then getting in front of the contacts, the importers, the kind of people that control the market, if you will, and working to establish relationships with them. We've been able to, through some of our virtual events, get really good contact with some of the Japanese buyers of industrial ethanol, and starting to have those conversations. We've gotten some feedback from them about concerns about GMO issues relative not only to the feedstock as well as the enzymes for ethanol. We have some U.S. producers that have provided information to demonstrate that there aren't GMOs in either the feedstock or the enzymes, depending on what feedstock they're using. But it's an emotional battle, as Tommy notes, and so making sure that we continue to advance that narrative and look for ways to fill that, create a more scientific discussion around it rather than an emotional one, in order to open up these opportunities for some other industrial applications and markets. So again, the real opportunities for industrial being outright replacing products, disrupting this market share that we've seen for demand that already exists, and then also continuing to build out some new uses in other markets. And then my last point here, we continue to overcome misinformation. Paul just mentioned a point about vehicle compatibility. This is a problem not only in Japan, it's a problem in Canada, where you have almost the exact same vehicle fleet between the U.S. and Canada, and we faced back in 2019 and even 2020 faced pretty heavy resistance from the auto manufacturing groups there and others, saying that their vehicle fleet was not compatible with using higher blends of ethanol, even to E10, let alone E15. And so, we continue to have to develop materials to overcome that misinformation. We're working now with NREL on a study to, demonstrate or look at the vehicle fleet compositions in many of our top markets, and compare those as well as the part components of them for not only vehicles but also two-wheelers to demonstrate that there's vehicle compatibility, and want to roll that study out and work with the local ministry officials there to demonstrate that compatibility. But again, some of these issues that we've resolved continue to be a problem in other markets. Questions about infrastructure. This is something that comes up. It's good, not only to use the U.S. example, but to use other countries' examples of how they've dealt with infrastructure and it being compatible. Colombia is an example. They use 10% ethanol in that market, so it's sometimes easier to be able to share the Colombian example with other Latin American countries or even countries in sub-Saharan Africa, rather than just saying, here's the U.S. example. You can trust us, or you can see that we're able to do it. It's helpful to have other examples from around the world of also developing countries, so that they can see and kind of, it's more familiar to them. And certainly, especially in Latin America, it's more culturally familiar as well. And then to my last point, overcoming misinformation. Really, we continue to develop partners in country that can carry our message, that can, we can cultivate that partnership, but we have someone who's not only kind of left behind in the market to, continue that conversation as they're in their own ministry or they're in, their own space within the market. But it's also, again, having a non-U.S. entity carry some of our message. Many countries have feedstock groups. They've got different consumer education advocacy groups. And so it's finding which partners are there that can carry our narrative. And we've built out, more success in India by working on that. Previously worked exclusively with the Sugar Milling Association, but also have found, work with the automobile groups and some of the fuel groups there, doing the same thing in Nigeria, figuring out where some of those partners are, as well as Mexico, as we delivered an economic analysis, really used the local group, local energy group to be able to convey, these reductions in the benefits to the Mexican economy. So I would say that last point is really key in finding who those folks are, making sure they're the right fit, and then, continuing to provide information to them and through them that can carry our message going forward. So, Colin, with that, that's the end of my formal presentation, but happy to take questions and any comments, feedback that anyone has.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Brian. And yeah, I guess anybody who's on the call with a question, please fire away.
Yeah, Brian, Jim Reed here. Maybe if you could just touch a little bit more in depth on the MTBE and the Mexico issue. There's going to be a discussion about that next week with NCGA, and just to try to give everybody that may not have a good understanding of why they use it, where it comes from, and the tariffs, to just give us a little more in depth on that.
Sure. So we export about half of our MTBE that we produce to the Mexican market. And then the rest goes to pretty much Venezuela and Chile. So it's MTBE is a major export from the U.S. to the Mexican market. They use it, frankly, for the same reason we used it in the 90s and early 2000s as an oxygenate. But really, what the issue is setting the limit on overall ethanol use into the market at 5.8%. So one of the, what we're working on now and going through the procedural process to the Supreme Court is getting through the procedure in order to convey that 5.8% should not be the limit or either the minimum or the maximum that's allowed, moving from that number to 10%, which we've seen here in the U.S. So we've conveyed that through economic analysis, showing the benefit of either, using zero ethanol, which is most likely is pretty much the case today, going to 5.8%, and then really showing the economic value going to 10%. So that's one way we're conveying that. The other way is, that the Mexican Pemex, the National Oil Corporation, stands to benefit by shutting some of their MTBE infrastructure down, and then updating the RON levels that's coming out of the refineries in order to take advantage of using ethanol. So it's something similar that we did here in the U.S. And so conveying that message as well, and then also talking about the imported gasoline that comes into the market, and demonstrating how those three factors can limit the overall cost to the Mexican consumer by using ethanol. And we've seen a lot of resistance in the past from the industry. It's been quiet for now, I would say. They are the ones who initiated a lot of these legal reviews, citing environmental concerns, when really, the environmental concern is just as we saw here, is concerns about groundwater. We have not moved in the direction of directly attacking the industry and demonstrating those groundwater concerns in Mexico to date. It's been more of demonstrating the economic value rather than trying to find point out the environmental detriment for using MTBE. So that's kind of where we are right now. We did face some resistance in the previous administration, again, because you've got one U.S. export looking at another U.S. export and kind of replacing that. So there was some resistance that we saw. However, back to my point about the 46% GHG reduction, we think we've got a good story to tell to the Biden administration about using MTBE or using ethanol and replacing MTBE in terms of exports to the Mexican market, in part because it reduces those overall emissions, but also in USMCA, there's an environmental chapter, and so our thought was to include ethanol into those types of discussions. So there's a couple different points that we're touching on for MTBE in Mexico. It still remains the U.S.'s largest export market, and as we've seen in the past, they're going to continue to fight to make sure they maintain that market share.
Okay, thank you.
Brian, this is Rod. Question on the Japanese market. If we were able to get the Japanese market to move towards ethanol and away from ETBE, how long do you think, when would you see a horizon on that? Year, a couple years, if possible?
I think it's longer than that. So right now, already written into the Japanese policy is to revisit the overall use of ETBE in the market in 2023. So we're seeing that as a short-term revision to the market where they could potentially double their use of ETBE in 2023. So that's the short-term, 2-year outlook. I would say 2025 is the timeline that Tommy has estimated where, possibly direct blending could be used in the Japanese market. He's already working on that as sort of a parallel track to this increased ETBE use. But it's, there's been quite a bit of resistance, especially from those vehicle groups, the oil groups there. And so that's why he's enlisted some different consulting groups and public affairs groups in order to kind of navigate that. That's the type of approach that has helped us, as well as, really high level support from the U.S. administration in getting them to increase our market share for the ETBE market. And our expectation is that it's going to take high level U.S. government support to move to direct blending.
Just as a side comment for some of us, ETBE has much the same characteristics as MTBE. So Its half-life is the same. There is not one.
Right, and other than Japan, I think the French are the kind of other major user of ETBE. It's not something we promote. But for us, it was the only way to get into the Japanese market, since they had made that decision back in 2009 to go that route.
Yeah, this is kind of unrelated to Grains Council. There's some thought out there that we ought to eliminate MTBE production in the U.S. and it will be difficult to produce ETBE if we do eliminate MTBE.
Ryan, this is Paul Jeske. We've got to pause. Back to Mexico. I mean, I personally sure had high hopes for that country several years ago that we'd be sending lots of ethanol there. But now, if you were to point to one or two single factors as to why there is the resistance that there is there, not what's on the surface, but what's underlying some of the opposition, who would the main entities be that are fighting so hard to keep ethanol out of the country, in your opinion? I keep pointing to the fact that some years ago saw some data on political contributions, money flowing from up there down to there. I keep thinking a lot of this is political in nature. Do you think that is the case, or are there groups that genuinely have legitimate concerns about ethanol use?
So I think I think there's a couple of factors, Paul. I think one is the fact that not only does Mexico import MTBE, but also, Pemex is producing it directly. So there's a concern that if they shut down those assets, that it's going to harm them. And so overcoming that, kind of mental block has been a big issue. I would say to date, the big issue is coming directly from the president in terms of energy reform in Mexico and trying to reinvigorate the state and national oil industry, Pemex. We've seen a lot of the early market entrants, which is all the oil groups that we're familiar with, make investments down in Mexico in 2014, 15 and on. When that market started to liberalize, but these energy reforms that we've seen out of the AMLO administration are probably the most concerning in terms of our market access going forward. Again, the MTB is the problem, kind of the day-to-day problem, but I would say if you've got a president who only wants to prioritize domestic production, limited opportunities. No real domestic ethanol production at this point in Mexico. You've got, some local producers that have talked about building a plant for a number of years that hasn't materialized without demonstrating that rural economic demand. It's going to, or rural economic opportunity for Mexico. It's easy for that administration to move forward and say, these are the energy reforms we're doing to support, what provides nearly 40% of the revenue to the Mexican government.
Well, just a couple more questions then. Isn't over 2/3 of the MTBE produced in this country and shipped down there? Aren't they a minority producer themselves? Isn't the majority coming from here?
Yeah, the majority is coming from here, and I want to say we're also exporting. I want to say it's about 40% of or 45% of gasoline demand finished gasoline is coming from the U.S. as well.
And then, has there ever been any talk? I mean, we do ship a lot of corn into Mexico. Has there ever been any talk about putting ethanol plants at the end of those rail lines, and so they could have the job creation within their country and do the value added themselves?
So, they had the tortilla crisis a number of years ago where white corn is a food staple. And so, talking about using corn for ethanol has really been untenable in that market. Sorghum is different on the other hand. There's not an issue with using sorghum or sugarcane, but it's really, that food versus fuel argument really hits home using corn for ethanol in Mexico.
Even though it's the yellow, not the greatest quality, not what they want to put into their tacos. It's just a perception thing. It's not
Right.
someone actually knows what it looks like. Okay, thank you.
So Brian, I have a couple quick questions. One is, so the U.S. saw about a 10% decrease in the gasoline market this year, or in 20. What was the global number?
About the same. It's 10 to 15% depending on the market. It was pretty consistent across the board, frankly.
Okay. And then the other question, I guess, is just kind of a broader, maybe a little bit philosophical, but I have a feeling I know the answers, but I figure I should ask. So the top gasoline consuming markets in the world aren't necessarily the largest ethanol importers. Could you kind of, I don't know, just talk about some of those other markets and why we're focused on the markets we are focused on and not Russians or the Saudis or the Iranians or whatever?
Yeah, so a lot of our initial focus was on markets that had either ethanol policies in place or had the capability to produce ethanol domestically. We found the most success where a country is able to have a domestic industry that can advocate for expanded ethanol use that benefits from producing ethanol in the ag sector and the rural sector that's then converting the feedstock to ethanol. And so that's where a lot of our work started. And so that's why, Canada has been such a great customer to us. They've had this policy since 2009. We've supplied 40% to that market for the last decade. The Philippines is another example. Policy went into place at the exact same time. That's a top 10 export market, really consistent. They're able to get some benefit from producing domestically, from using their molasses there, and then we kind of backfill the rest. We've looked at markets like Russia. The problem that the Russians had a number of years ago was an excise tax differential that was really trying to limit. There wasn't a clear distinction between ethanol for vehicle use versus ethanol for human consumption. And so there was a very heavy tax on all ethanol. Again, there was no distinction between different variations of ethanol. That was, it was a public health initiative trying to get folks to drink less. That distinction changed in December of 2018, where they finally, said, there's potable alcohol, industrial applications, and then fuel uses, but we still haven't seen, any type of change in terms of overall production, in terms of the policy or output in the Russian market. They were trying to, repurpose some of the old, vodka distilleries that they had there into more larger scale ethanol production. That hasn't materialized. To date, it seems like the Russians are more keen to export grain. For the Saudi market, you're right. It's another large market. We've seen some product go into that market, but other markets in the Persian Gulf that where we export ethanol to, primarily the United Arab Emirates and Oman, are servicing a third market, which is Iraq. And so when that price differential between ethanol and ETB is right, they'll use ethanol and blend that and then export it to the Iraqi market. So, Iraq doesn't have the feedstock to be able to produce ethanol. It's, and similar to Japan, similar to Korea, but it's kind of, identifying where those opportunities exist, making sure there's, not some technical barrier, and then using product there, and then so that they can use our product. Some of the other large markets, Korea is another example. We've pushed on Korea. It's a large export market for us for the industrial use, but Korea is a country that has made commitments around using. They've done a lot of research around implementing their own ethanol policy. They don't have the feedstock, but they do have a desire to improve their air quality, diversify some of their energy sources, and also they have a lot of refining capacity in country that they use for the Korean market, but also export finished product to Southeast Asia. And so we're kind of, now that we've moved on from the feedstock producing countries, we look at sort of the large gasoline demand markets, and then those with environmental interests that we can kind of latch ourselves onto and see if we can make progress there. The Koreans are using biodiesel. They're a heavy diesel market, but we still think there's opportunities to continue engaging with them on the ethanol side. So you're right, we aren't including some of the major markets, but we've investigated it, and frankly, the opportunity just we haven't seen it yet. We've always positioned ourselves to be nimble, and we have contacts in those markets, but until we see some type of material change, we've kind of pulled out from those opportunities.
Thanks.
Say anything about the industrial ethanol market as far as global?
You can just go ahead. Dave's got a question. Sorry.
Yeah, if you can hear me okay, Ron, I was a little late, so I apologize. Did you address the global industrial ethanol market, and maybe what has been the percentage growth over the last couple of years? Because we're seeing a lot of ethanol companies in this country investing in that market, investing in producing industrial grade alcohol now.
Certainly. Yeah, so we're exporting about a quarter of our ethanol to service industrial demand around the world. India, Korea, Mexico, and Nigeria are the top markets for industrial demand now. We saw a pretty heavy uptick in product going to Korea, Mexico, as well as some EU markets in response to the demand driven from COVID. Saw some, really, I think a doubling or a tripling of product going to Mexico to produce ethanol and disinfectants in that market. So, part of how we have, responded to increased inquiries is providing information from U.S. suppliers to let, overseas customers know that USP grade alcohol is available from the U.S., that, other grades of industrial alcohol is available, and so that's the sanitizer market, but then also trying to better understand what those opportunities are for other applications, whether it's food use or kind of solvent or, components into bioplastics. So continuing, or again, just kind of replacing methanol, as we've seen in the EU as well as the Korean markets. So, for several months this year, Dave, or in 2020, we saw U.S. exports, almost, half of all of our exports went to supply industrial demand because, fuel demand just dropped off the map from, March through July, depending on the market. But you're right. What we've tried to do is continue to incorporate talking about those different grades to the overseas customers, because we do know that a lot of that production came online, and frankly, we're not going to need this amount of hand sanitizer forever. And so making sure that we have overseas awareness about, how that the product is available coming out of the U.S. For these customers to access.
All right. Well, are there any other questions? All right. Well, if not, I guess we can shut it down. So thank you very much, Brian. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Sure, happy to be here. And if there's any further questions, I can answer them over email or do any follow-up as needed.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, take care, and thanks again.
All right. Thank you all. And thanks very much for your support.
Thanks, Brian.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah,